Here we go. Okay. So if you remember our conversation here in the United States, we spent several decades um, ignoring mental processes. We felt that they weren't scientific, they weren't studyable. So we studied associative learning, reward and punishment, stimulus response, those types of things. But there was a things that came along, as I explained in previous lectures, such as cognitive maps. How does a little rat understand how to go through a maze if they've never physically gone through a maze? How does and language in and of itself, how does it develop? Because it can't just be reward and punishment, as B.F. Skinner stated. Um, and then the other aspect that I mentioned in our learning class previously is that once you give the option of choice with human beings, the rules of reinforcement and punishment and even some associative learning ideas go out the window. And we ended also talking about the issue of social learning. How is it that a person can look at several behaviors, combine those, and then create their own new type of behavior? And I think I used a spaghetti example for that. And so, because of that, and because of the variability in human behavior itself, around the 1960s, psychologists decided that we need to start studying mental processes if we're going to really understand human behavior and what goes on when we go through things like decision making and those types of things. And this occurred at an interesting time because if we look at the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, we see the development of computer systems. And a lot of psychologists and a lot of computer information systems individuals wondered, why did humans create computers the way we created them? Okay. Meaning, we know we have to have an import type of device like a keyboard, a microphone, a camera, those kinds of things. But why did we separate two storage systems? For example, why is it in a computer we have what's called RAM, or random access memory, which is what runs all our programs as they're open and runs all of the systems that are active? And then why did we create this long-term memory system that then stores that information until it needs to be retrieved at a later date? Okay. And they came to understand that comparing these systems with humans and doing a lot of research, that we created computer systems kind of almost after our own image. That in fact we do, computers do, I'm going to reverse the script on this, but computers really operate how us humans operate, in that we have kind of three phases of memory. Okay. The first phase is encoding. Using the computer model, this is when you type into a word processor. It's when you record yourself, like we're recording this lecture verbally, or if we had our videos on. All of that information is going into that system. Okay. If we think about this kind of in human terms, this is the sensation system, right? This is taking external stimuli and getting it into the system. Okay. And this is the process of encoding. And then we have the systems of storage. And we find that we have two systems of storage, which we'll get into in much more detail this coming Monday. But just like a computer, we have what's called a working memory, or short-term memory is the old term. And then we have a long-term memory, which is our kind of permanent storage unit for our system. Okay. So we have a system that has a limited amount of capacity that then processes information, and then some of it is transferred into long-term memory. And then when that information is needed, just like opening up a file in your computer back into the working memory, or the other area where you'll work with that information more, hopefully you save it and it goes back into your long-term memory. So that's kind of how these systems work. Um, Using the basic computer model as an example, okay? So let's talk a little bit more about encoding, okay? Because there's really two types of encoding that humans do. We do what is known as automatic encoding, which is this very effortless system. We don't need to focus on something. We don't have to pay attention to something for information to get in. Okay. This is where things like associative learning and classical conditioning occurs, on this really automatic level where our brain automatically associates stimuli in the environment with what we're experiencing. Okay. And this system works mainly on the unconscious level within the limbic system. Okay. It's just information that is automatically processed. This would be if we were to use the computer example as an automatic processing. It is when in the background you're using an AI system to run numbers as you're working on something else, something like that. Okay. Effortful encoding is when we're purposely attending to something and trying to make something memorable, and something that we could do. So we can think about things like studying for an exam, hopefully focusing on this lecture. We can also think about um, um, going out with friends and having a really good night, or remembering our wedding or our divorce or a birthday or a graduation day. And we really focus on that day and pay attention to it. Okay. And this is where the role of attention really comes into play. And and the three main types of attention that psychologists have focused on are something called selective attention. This is when we are selectively attending to pay attention to something. So this could be, for example, paying attention to the TV, paying attention to something that someone else is saying versus someone else. I'm hoping you're using at least a little selective attention in this lecture as other stimulus is occurring around you. Divided attention has also been known as multiple multitasking, but psychologists prefer the term divided attention because research pretty much has validated the fact that we can't multitask. What we do is what's called serial tasking, where we switch attention from one stimuli to the next, but we can't pay attention to more than one of the stimulus is at the time. And so now this is that I want to make sure everyone understands this. This is different than using a distraction device. So some people say, well, I study better when I'm listening to music. Okay. That's not multitasking. That is what you would call a distraction device, so that you can focus on what you want to, because you know if any other auditory stimulus comes into the environment, you're going to lose.
All in all.
Okay, so that's what that is. Now, so multitasking. So I just want to give some simple research to kind of highlight some of the findings in this. So, let's talk about people who think that they're really, really good multitaskers. It's that individual that says they drive better when they're texting and listening to music really loud and focusing on an emails. I say that because I've known a few people like that. And then let's say we take some people who say, I have to focus on what's immediately in front of me. Okay. And then let's put them in a driving course where they could make, let's say, 10 mistakes because of not attending to what they're doing. Okay. And what we find in this type of research is the people who swear that they're better multitaskers make the same number of driving mistakes as the people who say they have to attend. In fact, they make more in some research. So the idea that you multitask and you're better at and you perform better is kind of a misnomer. Okay. Now, with that being said, other research. So let's look at gender. Um, because on gender, it's true that on average, women do better at divided attention or multitasking things. Okay. That on average, women are better multitaskers than men. However, there's a caveat to this is if you compare women who have never had children, they do no better than men. It seems to be women who have children who are their primary caregiver for a time period after giving birth that tend to make it so that the average number of women actually score better on divided attention because these women score off the chart. Okay. And the question is, well, what's going on here? And I'll also say in industrial organizational psychology, one of the things we always encourage employers to do is always bring back your female employees after maternity leave. Because believe it or not, they are actually more productive as well because they have these divided attention abilities. Okay. So, what is the current theory, and what are some of the things that we're curious about? There has been biological examples such as hormonal changes, those kinds of things. Probably the best explanation that has been brought out is when you have an infant, in the first 2 years, they need attention 24/7. They can't exist without a primary caregiver there. But that primary caregiver also has other obligations in their world, such as, warmth, housing, maybe work, maybe domestic type stuff, relationships with other human beings. And so they're constantly having to shift their attention back and forth from care for this infant that needs them and is completely dependent upon them to other life obligations. And that one tends to make more sense. I think, though, that what needs to be done to kind of clarify the gender differences in the divided attention thing is there has been no research on whether men who are the primary caregiver at their child's birth also become better at multitasking. And so this is kind of the kind of issue that I kind of have with the research as it is stated on gender right now is there's no real research that compares men who are the primary caregiver to birth to women who are not. And so I think there's a little bit more work that needs to be done to kind of show these hypotheses that have been proposed about whether it's something biological, hormonal, or whether it's something that is learned because of the demands of the newborn infant. I think this one has a little bit more to um, state, But I would say, no matter what gender, the IO research does suggest that they actually become both men and women become higher performers when they have maternity leave with their families. So, anyways, that's going on a caveat with industrial organization. So now let's go back now to selective attention and sustained attention. What is really the difference? Sustained attention is when you have to have a continual visual and sometimes auditory focus on a given object. So if you want to think about a guard at a guard tower, needing to keep constant vigilance on invaders from the outside or maybe their inmates on the inside. Um, and so that is vigilance. Okay. The selective attention is kind of what I'm hoping you're all doing here in the class, is that you're paying attention to this lecture instead of all the various vast stimuli that is going on in your world. If you want to also maybe give another good example of this, normally in normal weather driving conditions, we do selective attention. We ignore kind of all the other stimuli and we just pay attention to the road. But when it's really, really stormy out and we're not really confident in the roads and the people around us, we get sustained attention. And you can probably guess which one is more exhausting. Now, with that being said, um, uh, we actually are not very good at selective attention or sustained attention. Okay. I think I've mentioned in the class before that if you really hear a really awesome lecture, and I experience this all the time, and I want to go home and tell my family about this lecture and remember what the professor or the presenter said almost word for word. And I go and I get in front of them and I say, this is some awesome information. And it doesn't come out the same. It kind of comes out sometimes, my family kind of look at me going, did you really pay attention? Um, this is the reason behind this is that when we're using selective or sustained attention, the neurons that are being used to focus on that burn out. And so you have to shift your attention and shift it back and shift it away. Okay. And in fact, research on even your most favorite classes show that within about 6 months of this class, you'll only probably remember about 15% of it because of the way your attention shifted during lectures or when you were trying to sustain attention while reading a book and all of these things. And when we get to social psychology, we'll get into what do we usually shift our attention to. Usually it's other people or ourself interacting with other people, but that's a story for another day. Okay. So how then can we improve purposeful or selective attention? Well, the main way is to understand that we have these shifts in attention, and that if we use kind of the mindfulness idea, it's recognizing when we're shifting away and trying to mentally bring ourselves back. That's one way that's very cognitively tasking. But the other way is to recognize that we have selective attention, and it's okay to once in a while shift your eyes away from the presentation. It's okay to listen into what's happening into the other room, but then make sure you come back and get into the conversation. Sustained attention is an interesting one because how do they train, for example, a military guard, someone who's guarding the base and is in one position and is supposed to pay attention to the wide spectrum of what's in front of them? Well, they actually teach them don't try to look at all of it. They usually tell the guard person to divide what you're supposed to be paying attention to into smaller chunks. So if you'll notice, if you ever go to like someone who is doing sustained guards, their head will either move slightly every couple seconds, or their eyes will, because that's allowing the neurons to make that sustained attention without burning those neurons out again. So, sustained attention is chunking up what your vigilance is about, chunking up what you're supposed to be vigilant about into chunks that your brain and neurons could handle. Okay. So, that's some ways to think about that if you need to do those things. Okay, so that's attention. Now, let's talk about levels of processing. Okay, so it usually happens on a continuum and really determines how much we actually remember. And again, going to perceptions, how we build information in our head really determines what we experience. And so I kind of want to use this diagram here. So most of the time when we're either attending to something and ignoring everything else, or if we're just stuck in mind thinking while we're walking down the street and thinking about life or other things, usually we're doing what's called shallow processing, meaning that we're just getting in like the physical and perceptual features of things, so lines and angles, physical appearance, such as a car maybe, are detected. And that's usually when we're deep into our thoughts, or we're trying to attend to something else. That's usually what we're processing in our given environment. Okay. And then there's intermediate processing. This is where we are recognizing things and we're providing them with labels. So we recognize, I'm looking out my front window right now and I see I have a neighbor to my right. He has a truck right there. It's a Dodge Ram. The people across the street, they have a Tesla. The people across the other way, oh, I don't even know what car they are. That's always in the garage. I'm not being weird about this. I'm just telling you I'm actually looking out my window, so don't think I'm weird about that. But anyways, but I recognize these vehicles because I'm giving slight attention to them, but they really don't have any meaning. So they're not necessarily going to be something I remember when I reflect on, did I teach something decent in this class today? I probably won't remember the cars, I'll remember that I mentioned cars, but I probably won't remember which ones. Okay. And then there's deep processing. This is when we give a deep semantic meaning to the symbols and characteristics we use. This is when we're really focusing on what we're experiencing. We're there, we're present, we want to focus. So this could be just seeing a car that you really, really like and imagine you driving it um, by the beach, like it says right here. Or it may be when you're studying and you're really focusing and wanting to make what you're studying meaningful. Or it may be a deep conversation you're having with someone and really engaging in it and giving it meaning and symbolization. Okay. We will learn on Monday when we talk about eyewitness accounts. These levels of processing is what makes eyewitness accounts very, 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 very unreliable. Okay. And research done uh, on this shows that we are very inconsistent in our stories. And I think I kind of showed this when we went over the perception section where I did that priming example. If you remember, read a story about being in the city versus being out in the woods, and then we flashed that picture for about 1.5 seconds, which really only allowed for shallow or intermediate processing, which made it so that the person had to rely on their memories to create in their mind what they saw. Okay. And most of the time when we witness a crime or we witness something violent, we don't necessarily expect it. So we're not walking around analyzing every single person going, are they going to rob the bank? Is this person going to hit? And what is it about them that we don't usually do that? Hopefully they happen randomly and we're not expecting them. And so most crimes that eyewitnesses experience are done at the shallow and intermediate level, which means that they have to fill in the rest of their information. And it's usually based upon their own personal biases, their own personal priming effects that they may have had earlier in the day about other people who mistreated them. It probably, and all of these biases that kind of fill our brains will fill in that information. And so we see over the last couple decades where many Black men have been accused by eyewitness accounts and have been put in jail. And then over the last couple decades, they've been released because of DNA evidence. This is an example of that, and something that we really should look at least on the legal end of things. So these are examples of processing, and then we'll leave it at this for tonight. The video mentioned elaborative processing or elaborative encoding. Okay. And this is when you make something, if you want to remember something, you have to make it unbelievable almost. You have to really have that experience that awes you. And it needs to be vivid and self-referencing, meaning that you can see yourself in that experience that maybe you are experiencing. Okay. Elaborative encoding is about how many mental hooks you can put into a bit of information in order for it, if you want to think about it from a neural perspective, so it can make those neural connections with several other neural connections so that memory is strengthened. And this is why in a lot of your classes, you'll notice that the instructor in the discussion questions will ask you, how does this apply to you? Or what is your experience with this? They're not trying to get you to disclose some personal things. What they're trying to get you to do is allow you to personally connect with that information to make it more meaningful and more useful, and you'll remember it easier. Okay. And the other thing that we'll leave for tonight with is that idea of spatial memory, the visual spatial area instead of our front rational area of the brain to remember something. And I'll leave with this. So my son, he has his doctorate in physics, which I'm very proud of, but he really, really loves, and I don't understand why, the math part of it. He loves looking at equations and solving them. He loves putting coding into something and see what will happen. Um, and I asked him once, how does he do it? And he said something that I remember from my undergraduate years, and then I looked it up to make sure it's still valid, is he said that he doesn't do the rules of mathematics where you do the addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, those the rules. He says when he looks at an equation, he visually sees those numbers interacting with each other and coming together in some way, in some type of visual spatial representation. Okay. And this is often what we have found in psychological research is people who can be really good at an instrument, who are really, really good at math, who do good at certain types of things as kind of the savants, if you want to say, is that when they do things, they don't do it based on the rules of logic. They do it in the visual, spatial, temporal area of the brain where it's all visual spatial associations. Okay. And so I between now and Monday, we'll get into more deeper study skills, more concrete study skills as we talk about our two different memory systems on Monday. But I want you to kind of think about that over the weekend about how you can create your memory palaces, that you can put things in and start to spatially and visually represent stuff, because sometimes logic isn't the best way to learn. Sometimes we actually have to experience it, at least in the mind's eye. All right, I'm going to stop sharing right here, and I'm just going to ask, all right, you can put yes or no in the chat. Oh, I need to stop our recording. Sorry.